That's even better than scribing.
It is. Wendy gets extra points. All right. Thank you, Leif. Thank you, Wendy. And the blue sheets are going about?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Let's get started. So this is the HTTP session. This is the note well. You should be familiar with this. This is the terms under which we participate here, especially regarding intellectual property. If you're not familiar with this, you can use your favorite search engine to look for IETF note well. Likewise, this is an environment where we want to keep it professional. We have an ombuds team. I always get that wrong. If you feel that you have an issue where someone's behaving unprofessionally or harassing you, you can contact them, and they are the three people at the bottom of the slide. The blue sheets are going about. We have a scribe and Gabriel. Thank you once again. Can someone act as a jabber relay for any questions that come up there? Anyone? I have a hand in the back. Thank you. That was Ted. And agenda bash. Today, our session, we're going to have about 30 seconds talking about the contribution policy to make sure that everybody understands what we did there. We have a session of proposed work. So Mike's going to talk about secondary certs. Patrick's going to talk about WebSockets and H2. And I'm going to talk about HTTP TER or BIS or Prime or whatever we decide to call it. And then, depending on time available, we'll talk about some related work that might eventually be proposed work. I'm going to talk about variants. We have Shivan talking about 451, new protocol elements. And finally, Adrian talking about HTTP payments. Any bashing on that? Okay. Yeah, Friday is the session where we'll talk about all of our active drafts. And we'll go over those then. So, first of all, the contribution policy. I just wanted to take a very quick moment and make sure everybody understood. Oh, great. The screen blocks the other screen. So we talked a little bit on the mailing list about revising this slightly to align better with what's happening over at Quick. And the big change here is that we now don't go through a formal process of saying that all closed issues have working group consensus. The issue status in terms of open-closed more reflects the editor's feelings about where the issue is. So we use it as an internal tracking mechanism. When we need to declare consensus on an issue and say that this issue truly has working group consensus, we have a special tag for that, has consensus. But the general process is, we gather consensus as the draft progresses, and we confirm final consensus in working group last call. Is that understood? I think it's fairly uncontroversial. We talked about it on list. I just wanted to make sure it was in front of everyone. Okay, great. So let's move on. Secondary certificates. Mike, you want to come on up? And I'll get your presentation up.
Wow, they make the pink box rather tiny this year. Let's see. This only goes up so far. Okay. So, you got the slides coming up here. Secondary search is something we've talked about a bit in the past. We have been kind of quiet about it for the last couple IETFs. It was on time permitting for Prague. This is an idea that grew out of some limitations that we were struggling with between TLS and HTTP2. I will very briefly recap it because I'm assuming most of you have heard the discussion in the past, and then I'll talk about where we are and where we head from here. So next slide. So as we're probably all familiar with, TLS gives you one server certificate and at most one client certificate. So if you have a case where a server possesses multiple server certificates, too bad. You got to pick one for the connection. And you get a client certificate. TLS 1.3 limits your ability to present the client certificate later in the connection. TLS implementations existing for TLS 1.2 don't play well with trying to continue passing data, which you want to do on a multiplex protocol, while you are renegotiating to present the cert. And then there's a more fundamental problem when you're trying to do HTTP2 with that. Next slide. We prohibit renegotiation in HTTP2 anyway, so you effectively can't present a client certificate. So this work grew out of, number one, we have enterprise cases that still use client certificates that we really would like to move to HTTP2. We don't want to stick them on HTTP 1.1, or even worse, run them over HTTP2 and then fire an HTTP 1.1 required error at them as soon as you need a certificate, so they start the connection over and then renegotiate and present the cert. And the work that led into this was, once we had a mechanism to present a client cert at the HTTP layer, you could just as easily present a server cert at the HTTP layer. So next slide. The extension relies on a draft that's been adopted in TLS now that's called Exported Authenticators. It says once you have a TLS session established, you can export a blob that proves that you have a certain other certificate than what you negotiated in TLS. And then we use HTTP frames to pass these around and say, I would like to see your cert for example.com. And then the server can send back the example.com cert, and vice versa. If you want to do client certificates, the server can be very precise about, for this request, I need a client certificate that looks like this, and the client can return it. So if you want to look at the flows, next slide, when you're dealing with servers, the server might send you an origin frame that asserts it is authoritative for more domains than are in its TLS certificate, in which case the client would say, I would like to see the certificates for these domains, they're interesting to me, and the server proves that it has a certificate chain that maps up to that domain. And at that point, the client would be willing to make requests and coalesce more broadly onto a connection than they could with a single certificate. And next slide, if you look at the client side, clients make a request, and what happened in HTTP 1.1 over TLS is that at this point, the server would renegotiate and say, I'd like to see your client certificate before I answer that. And so in HTTP 2, or HTTP over QUIC for that matter, we would be able to do effectively the same thing without relying on renegotiation at TLS. The server can say, well, here's the definition of a certificate I'd like to see, and I'm requiring it on this request. The client proves it has that certificate, links to it from the request, and then the request actually gets a response. So next slide.
I think so.
That has a couple of advantages that we've talked about before. For one thing, being able to coalesce more broadly, you can take advantage of larger TCP windows and all the other good reasons why we like to coalesce across domain names in HTTP2. And in a lot of cases, it's just not feasible or not preferred to have all of the domains that a server is authoritative for on the same certificate. Whether that's for being able to manage your certificates to a more granular level, or you're a CDN where you have the certificates from different properties, but they don't mutually trust each other and want to be on the same certificate. This also gives you a way to do encrypted SNI, that you can open the TLS connection asking for one certificate, and then in your zero OTT data say, and I would also like to see your certificate for sensitiveinfo.com. On the client side, client certificates are a real thing. It's kind of a pain not having them in HTTP2. And at Microsoft, that had not been a problem until we shipped the version of Windows Server that supported HTTP2, but couldn't do client certificates over that. And then suddenly people start complaining, or they start getting kicked back to 1.1 and trying to figure out why they're spending more RTTs. So, next slide. Like I mentioned, this uses the Exported Authenticators draft that Nick Sullivan has done, and that has been adopted in the TLS working group in Chicago because we were asking for it. And this draft has basically been on hold while that makes some progress. It is now moving forward in the TLS working group. Nick, are we close to last call at this point, or?
Yes.
Yes, okay. We've had some discussion over the weekend at the hackathon. There are probably some properties that we need to change in exported authenticators and take advantage of here to get a few better bindings between requests and responses. But in general, that is moving forward, and I think that means it is time to ask the question on the HTTP side, are we ready to adopt this? Because it now no longer depends on an individual draft. It depends on a working group draft in TLS. And that's what I got.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So fairly quick Mike-line questions, statements of support, implementation interest, that sort of thing?
Ted Hardy, clarifying question. One of the use cases that you actually describe in the draft is the use case that's common in TLS where you wish to present a generic certificate or similar and then negotiate to a more specific or different certificate. So that you don't reveal what you're looking for in the SNI. I understand that there's also work on similar discussions going on inside the TLS working group. Is it anticipated that you would continue to describe it here or rely on it coming from a more generic mechanism?
I think Martin going to the mic line is probably the better person to answer that.
Yeah. Oh, great. I still on the Martin Thompson. I think the idea is this would be complementary to whatever TLS does. So TLS are looking more for a generic solution, whereas this, I think, would present a path for HTTP and could present a path for other protocols that decide to adopt a similar sort of scheme. But I don't think we're attempting to address the general problem here with this.
Okay, I think that's a fine clarification. Thank you very much. I would suggest at that point then, if this is going to continue to be in this, that particular use case get a good bit more discussion in the draft, especially around how it interacts with the HTTP origin. Because I think you treat that in some other aspects of the draft much more completely than it currently does. But I'm fine with adopting it and doing the work in the working group to do that. But I would suggest that we put it early on in the work program for this draft.
Okay.
Can we see a show of hands who's read the draft? Okay, good spattering of the room. Yeah, that's fairly good. Do we want to do some hums or? Yeah, Kazuha and Martin first.
Martin Thompson, I just wanted to point out that I think Nick has some implementation experience with this in a sort of form that was slightly removed from what we have in the current draft because we're making a few tweaks, but evidence suggests that it's implementable.
I will comment along those lines that not proving the certificate, but Akamai has done some experiments as well in just basically telling the client, believe the server if it sends you a broader origin frame, and then testing the resulting performance, and those are beneficial.
Okay, that's good to know.
Kazuho, firstly, I think that this draft is ready for adoption, and I'm interested in implementing it. On the other hand, I have a technical question, and I wonder if it would be possible to let the client always specify the certificate that is associated to the request instead of letting the server choose one. I ask this because CGI or fast CGI expect the client to specify just one certificate for every request, and it is often impossible for a HTTP server to determine which certificate is associated to which request.
I don't think there's any barrier to adding that other than the client not knowing what certificate the server is going to be looking for until it tells it. If the client has a way to know out of band, then it hypothetically could send you certificate right away.
Yeah.
Okay. So some of the changes that we've been discussing at the hackathon probably are going to mean we no longer support the client spontaneously sending the certificate and saying, you're going to want this, trust me. Which is probably okay. But once the certificate has been sent on the connection, then saying request by request, and yes, please use certificate number one for this request without the server having first asked for that request and saving a round trip, that should be doable.
So we've been discussing this in various ways in the background for quite some time, and it sounds like what we're coming to is we think it's time to adopt this formally. Does anybody have any reservations about doing so or objection to doing so that they want to bring up now? Okay, I think we'll take that to the list then. Yeah, we'll confirm that on the list. But thank you, Mike. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about WebSockets. Yay.
Good morning. Good morning. This is not hi-bye. This is HTTP-BIS. Next slide. Okay, as we've heard for a number of years, 6455, which describes the WebSocket protocol, as it likes to call it in all capital letters, uses a bunch of HTTP1 specific mechanisms to bootstrap itself. So it uses connections, host headers, and upgrade, all of which were removed from HTTP2 because they have connection-wide scope and conflicted with the multiplexing that is fundamental to 7540 in HTTP2. So, you know, we've been hearing about this for a number of years, about this mismatch, and the WebSocket community was very interested in having native H2 support. And I have, from time to time, put a bunch of energy into trying to determine, you know, what the real needs are there. So I had a hypothesis for quite a while that you know, the multiplexing and therefore the priority that has to go with the multiplexing features of HTTP2 could really benefit WebSockets. But it turns out really, you know, the desire from that community, by far the top level goal that was stated, was they didn't want to maintain a separate HTTP1 stack just to bootstrap WebSockets. Those other features of HTTP2 might maybe be a bonus, but the real problem was an administrative one in many respects, maintaining an HTTP1 stack just for the purpose of running their WebSocket stack. Okay, so next slide. With that in mind, we talked about this at a non-IETF event, the HTTP workshop in London last June, and we talked through some of the native HTTP2 proposals that have failed to gain traction, you know, in this space. And I suggested we could do the absolute minimal viable product here, which was just to take 6445 or 6455 rather, and tunnel it on an HTTP2 stream. So you would still have other HTTP2 streams. They could run other copies of WebSockets. They could run normal HTTP data. They could do whatever they want. And those would be multiplexed with each other, but within the individual stream, just like on a connect tunnel when you're connecting through a proxy, for instance, on that individual stream, it would run another protocol, in this case 6455. So the scope of what I'm proposing here is limited to HTTP2's initiation of 6455, and I think that's a suitable topic for HTTP-BIS to talk about. You know, changes to the WebSocket protocol, including things like masking, which is everyone's favorite, you know, I don't think are best done, you know, in this room. Like, hi-bye was the group that originally developed WebSockets, and I think it would be great if someone that wanted to build some extensions to the WebSocket protocol would continue to do that through someone who is chartered to work on that kind of problem. Okay. So there's a draft up there, an individual draft. There's an O2. We've been circulating the list for a little bit, but actually got technically published this morning when Data Tracker reopened. And what it does is it uses an H2 opt-in extension to create an extended connect. So the extension mechanism of 7540 lets you do pretty much anything you want with negotiated extensions. And this makes a change to what connect does. So connect fundamentally already builds tunnels, which is why I find it, you know, really interesting for this work, you know, but it is defined to make them, you know, in proxies using TCP to tunnel to a different host and port. And this really extends connect to apply to the origin server instead of a proxy and doesn't require the external connection. Okay, connect, as I like to say, is already a special snowflake in our documents. It works hop to hop, really unlike other methods. It builds bidirectional tunnels. It doesn't, you know, anticipate that the request needs to finish before the request starts and all that kind of thing. In that kind of way, it's a pretty good match for what we're trying to accomplish. The other option that folks love to, you know, to debate here is whether the old H1 semantic of a method like get with an upgrade header is a better fit. And the way I kind of look at those things is that's really an opportunistic version upgrade, you know, of a real request transaction, as opposed to connect, which is a real tunnel. And WebSockets is looking to establish a tunnel rather than any numbered version of a resource. So, next slide. So from the document, here's an example of what it would look like. So you see we're going to preserve much of the way 6455 works. So you initially have an opt-in setting. The server has to tell you that you can do this, and then the client puts together a connect request with an authority, which now means this is the origin rather than where I'm trying to tunnel through to, and a bunch of the things defined by 6455, various headers of what you need to negotiate. There's a little bit in the WebSocket protocol. It is designed fundamentally to make sure that JavaScript content can't create something that looks like a WebSockets handshake that isn't really WebSockets. That is not needed in this case because one of the key aspects of this proposal is a new pseudo header called protocol, which is something that a XHR or a JavaScript-based application can't create. So it accomplishes the same thing a little bit easier. My early drafts had a pure tunneling application where you actually essentially just created a blind pipe and you did a H1 or actually used the H1 syntax within the tunnel that was connected here. People preferred to move that metadata, things like the protocol version, the subprotocols, the extensions, etc. Outside that to the way it's traditionally been done. So this draft reflects this. So that's basically what we got for an overview. There's been a whole lot of discussion on this for an individual draft. Thank you. That's always motivating, right? And so I think if we keep this narrow just on the bootstrapping mechanism rather than trying to reinvent the ocean, I think we've got a potential answer here to a long-standing nagging problem. So I would like to suggest we adopt this.
Okay, let's go to the queue. Thank you, Patrick. Let's go to the queue.
Let the queue form. Martin Thompson, I like some of the properties of this. I like the fact that you've essentially taken the bootstrapping part of 6455 and said, well, we don't need any of that, and taken the bits that you actually need and put it in the header fields. That's a more natural translation. I like the fact that you signal that you support the particular thing. Obviously, if someone puts a colon protocol in an HTTP2 header block, the explosions will happen. And that's actually kind of a property that I like as well, is that this is not going to happen by accident. And if it does happen by accident, connections will die. So it's self-correcting fairly quickly. I think this is probably the right way to do things. And yeah, as you say, let's keep the translation as simple as possible. And this seems as simple as I can imagine. Oh, I also had to point out that I was convinced by your arguments about connect over the other methods. The fact that people actually have rules on their servers that block connect kind of has the right effect on this. I sort of took Mark's comments on the list about that to sort of imply that connect might not work, right. But that is actually an outcome that I kind of like now that I've thought about it.
I'll inject myself in the queue after Mike. Without a hat on.
Mike Bishop, Akamai. So I will point out that I've seen a lot of requests for WebSockets over HTTP2 recently. I kind of feel like these two presentations go together kind of well, as these are features we left out of H2 and now we regret it.
Yeah.
So I mostly like this design. I will point out that the original definition of connect says that if you send a connect to an end server, it can respond with 200 and say, yes, you are connected to me, please continue. So you're not doing anything invalid here. Let's move forward with it.
And so Mark Nottingham, no hats. My discomfort is mostly around, Martin says it's virtuous if the server refuses the connect. I guess, servers are deployed by many parties and often by multiple parties at the same time in different layers and without a lot of coordination. And I'm a little concerned here that, connect suddenly tripping WAF rules when people try to negotiate WebSockets may be a scenario that causes people some nightmares. So I've gone out and started talking to a few people who do that to figure out how much of a problem that really is. And I'm going to reserve further comment until I hear back from them. But it's not quite as simple. I know that from the browser side, you all maintain the code base. You've got tight control over that. Servers are often not like that. and I want to see how much pain it's going to cause. I think also that the pseudo header, my only concern there is around do we really want to set the precedent of extending the protocol with new pseudo headers? And that's maybe a little side discussion to have. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet.
Are you suggesting there are limitations to what an opt-in extension can negotiate? 7540 suggests you can rearrange
there are no limitations.
You can arbitrarily rearrange a headers frame, which I think would be a far more exciting thing to do.
Right. The question is, what do we want to promote as good practice?
So, I mean, I think here what we've got specifically are that pseudo headers apply to hop-by-hop transport-oriented headers, and I think that's applicable here.
Method is not hop by hop, generally speaking. Path is not hop by hop.
But it is the version of the transport encoding of the method, right? Which is done differently.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be part of the request headers of the transaction, right?
So
it's a property of
the high order bit for me is that I think we should adopt this. As long as we can continue to have these discussions.
Of course,
with
if we adopt this, change control belongs to the working group.
Awesome.
But until then, I write down anything I like.
All right. I'm also going to cut, with my chair hat back on, I'm going to cut the queue because I'm looking at the clock.
Kazuhoko, let me note that I now support using connect as the method, because otherwise we need to be required to introduce a new framing that distinguishes end of request and end of stream, and we don't want to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, just to respond to Mark's thing, it depends on whether you consider having WebSockets succeed as a special goal. Like to what extent you consider the success of WebSockets to be a goal, and I think to the extent that there are hurdles to using this, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Will Facebook? So can you go back one slide? So yeah, for the negotiation part, so does client need to waiting for the setting frame comes from server or not?
Yes.
So does it mean we need to waiting for one round trip time to set up the connection or finish the negotiation?
Yes. Oh, and depending on who sends first, it has a lot to do with how your handshake happens. But from the highest hypothetical point of view, yeah.
So can we move this setting to like first the client request, so client initiate, hey, I want to negotiation this setting with server rather than server send back this acknowledgement.
Well, this would be included. I mean, the way I would implement this in my server would be this option would be included in this first flight of the server settings anyhow. This isn't a different flight than their other settings. You can include this in the opening, the opening setting preamble essentially.
Yeah, Martin Thompson to that point. I did some analysis on this, and yes, in TLS 1.2, this does introduce a round trip over WebSockets previously. The fact that you actually have a usable HTTP 2 connection that's still usable prior to that point actually means that it's not as much of a problem as people like to think. In TLS 1.3, this is not a problem because the server will be able to speak first. And so you will have no worse performance with WebSockets. The only cost there is that because you're waiting on the settings, you won't be able to use WebSockets in 0 RTT, but I think we can live with that. Oh, I should point out, if you want to use WebSockets in 0 RTT, you've got a whole host of other problems that you might want to take a good hard look at. The whole replay thing is that just don't do that. Yeah.
Any other comments specifically about adopting this draft? Patrick, I'm going to ask you to come back over here and put your chair hat on. Thank you. Do you want to hear a hum? Or I think we've heard a fair amount. I think we're good. Yeah, so we'll take it to the list, I think. I think we've heard enough. Next up, let's reverse roles.
All right, next up, Mark's going to get up there, and he's going to talk to us about his plans around HTTP TER or BIS or Prime or whatever the case may be. We're still calling it TER, Mark?
I think that's a bike shed. So yes, it's a very small pink box. Hello. I and Julian and a few other folks have been talking about what we do with the RFC 72.3x document set for a little while. And since we've had HTTP2, it's become more noticeable that the factoring of the documents is not particularly great. We've had some discussions in the past about describing HTTP more abstractly and saying this is HTTP, the protocol as we know it, and then we have different wire serializations in 1 and 2 and eventually in QUIC as well, whatever we call that. And so it seems like a good opportunity to refactor the document set by opening it up, incorporating errata, and talking a little bit about that abstract model. And so we put a mailing list message out a while back trying to describe the goals of such an effort and to constrain it. So full disclosure, I've expressed interest in acting as an editor on this, as has Julian. And so if we did that, Patrick would be the acting chair for the effort. And he expressed, I think, a little bit of discomfort about it turning into a large effort. Let's face it, the last time we did this, we took a good 8 years, I think. Yeah. So we don't want to do that again. And so we want to keep it fairly tight. And this was the shape that we put together. So I just wanted to make sure people were aware of this and to get any comment as to how people felt about this shape of work and whether it gave Patrick some amount of comfort about embarking on such an effort.
So I will make the comment before the mic line opens that, I think the most valuable piece of this work is really to clearly separate the semantic layer that we somewhat casually refer to it as, from the other aspects of the protocol, and to write those down of what we can depend on, because that's become, with H2, and there were only sort of 2 versions of this, we were able to kind of muddle through, but this clearly becomes a bigger problem, over time. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that.
All right. Also, I was remiss. I need to point out the intent here would also be to take things to internet standard, which seems like it's probably overdue.
Ted Hardy speaking. I do have a bit of a question about timing here. Obviously, there's work going on in a different working group to attempt to create an HTTP over a new transport, and having this work going on at the same time seems like you both lose the opportunity to take on board the problems which are surfaced by the attempt to do it over new transport and the natural questioning of assumptions that goes on when you're engaged in that effort. And it also potentially means that the target for that work gets a little muddier than it needs to be. So I'd like to have you potentially explore for me or for the room, how you would see this work interacting with that work, because it strikes me there are a couple of different ways it could go pear-shaped, and one in which it might go well, but only might.
So to date, all the discussions we've had about that other work is that it would not change the semantic footprint of HTTP without significant involvement from this working group. And I think to date, the discussions have been such that we don't foresee making any huge changes. That might change in the future. And so far, when this has come up, I think I've heard this work portrayed as being quite helpful to that, in that we have a more well-defined target for that other work to look at. Whereas right now, it's spread across a bunch of documents in a somewhat haphazard way. And so I guess I was a little surprised to hear you say that, because at least from my perspective, wearing a bunch of different hats, I think this is good, provided we can do it in a reasonable amount of time. And I think that's the whole point here, is we do not want this to drag out.
Yeah, I mean, I, as HB chair, have received questions about essentially what is implicit and what is explicit, right? And
right.
If there is a
Exactly.
fundamental difference between those things, it would be nice to.
And maybe we should have that more explicitly in the goals, is to make that model much more explicit.
Ted Hardy again, with the kind accession of the people on the line. I appreciate your comments, and I do see that if this had been done before that work started, it would clearly have some opportunities to have exactly the the impact you describe. With the other work already underway and its chair telling me as hard as he can crack that whip, I do worry both about taking some of the energy from a fairly small group of people who understand both HTTP and Quick and forcing them to double focus. And I do just also believe that we are continuing to surface new things as we go through the Quick exercise about what a valuable way of expressing this in a transport neutral way would be. And I think there's going to be either a little bit of incurred delay as a result of doing this at the same time, or a little bit of missed opportunity as a result of doing it at the same time. So I'm happy that you're considering the matter carefully, but I do have some remaining caution.
I can understand that, certainly. I think this, as we're seeing it now, is going to be a fairly focused effort by just a few people. That's going to be validated by the rest of the working group. And I suspect that this is going to have to happen anyway for Quick to really be able to map well to HTTP. But let's go through the queue.
Martin.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I think that a good part of the motivation for this is actually helping Quick get its work done. That said, to Ted's comments, I'd be a little leery of publishing this before Quick was done.
Oh, yes.
Just because we're learning things. The one thing that bothers me most about the work program that you've outlined here is the one point on number 4 there, and that's the versioning thing. I think we're still learning about that, and that may be a little bit risky here. And
sorry.
I want to make sure that we understand it before we write it down, and saying that we're going to tackle it here is the only thing in this program that bothers me, but it does.
So just to contextualize that, we had those words are lifted verbatim from the charter for the original BIS effort. Yep. We attempted to do that then as well, and we did a lot. And this is not the be-all and end-all of HTTP extensibility. We need to continue to document best practice there, knowing that it's going to evolve.
The interesting observation from the previous attempt was that things were written down that did not match reality. When we did HTTP 2, we did something different to what was envisaged in 2616, right?
I think it's more your 2145. We went way off track from 2145, and we probably need to obsolete that. No, I'm speaking more about header extensibility, method extensibility,
all of those
that
things,
sort of stuff. Yeah.
All of those things, I think we have a reasonably good understanding of. I think it's the okay. Let's qualify that.
That's what I'm focusing on. Yeah.
We can improve, but that's just work, and I think that the people involved here are capable of doing that. I don't think to the same extent we're capable of saying anything definitive about how we do versioning, because we got it wrong before. We did it differently for H2. We're doing it differently again for Quick, and I'm not sure that we're doing it right either. And so I'd like a little more confidence in that before I pick that out. And so maybe striking "and versioned" from this thing and simply saying, well, it is what it is. We'll document what we have is what we need to do here.
I hear you, and I think I'd be happy to change that to just documenting how it's been versioned so far, rather than trying to lay down principles.
Your text does say clarifying, which may be mostly documenting, right? Yeah. So, Mark, I've been hesitant to ask, but since most of these questions have been about timeline, do you have any thoughts on timeline?
I'm happy to be as aggressive as the working group wants us to be. I need to talk to Julian, of course, and we'll have to confab. But I would hope that we could do this in certainly less than a year, which would put us on. I agree with Martin's statement. I think it was that we don't want to ship this before Quick HTTP ships, but I'd like to have it ready to go at the same time.
Mike Bishop, Akamai, and speaking here as both author of a draft that talked about how we decompose the semantic layer from the mapping, and now as the editor of HTTP over Quick. I think this is a separation that would be really helpful as we start to define Quick and as we look toward the future. I think the end versioned piece is interesting because, as you observe, we've kind of gotten it wrong. All the versioning that we have talked about has wound up being versioning of the mapping. And I don't know that we understand how we version the semantic layer because we've never seen them as separate entities until we kind of were doing H2 and now that we're doing Quick. And so we don't have a defined way to version them. And if we were to create one, that would be a change to HTTP, which I don't think is in the appropriate charter for this. But I think the work is useful, but I share a little bit of the concern around exactly how we weasel word our version.
Sure.
Jeff Hodges. So how does this possibly or at all relate to HTTP 2?
The HTTP2 document is written as a fairly standalone thing. I don't think we're going to need to modify it at all, except perhaps to file errata updating its references for the next revision or whatever.
So from a process point of view, yes, but it incorporates logically a lot of 7230 by reference, right? But not all of it, and that is actually, I think, one of the things you set out to clarify, right?
Right.
So I think if the question is about if this is work we're interested in taking on, I'm curious if Alexi has any comments, he would like to make before we ask the room if they think this is appropriate.
I don't have any objections, let's put it this way. And I think, I think there was a good set of concerns about timeline of related efforts, but I think it probably will help Quick or HTTP or Quick. So, and my only other comment is I would be curious, how well you can stick to your proposed timeline. So we shall see.
Well, the only thing that has caused real concern, I think, in our discussions has been there have been a number of cases where folks from browsers, especially doing other specifications that relate to this, have brought interoperability issues up or very fine error handling issues up. And I think we've come to a place where we've agreed we don't want to address that level of interoperability, certainly for HTTP1, unless there is a really critical security or a severe interoperability issue. And frankly, if it's a severe interoperability issue, we've probably already seen it. So I think that would be the only thing that would really blow out our timeline as we went through and talked about how to parse every header from scratch and defined algorithms and all that. And I don't think there's a will here to do that.
Okay, so let's just maybe first start with a show of hands. I'm interested in the number of people in the room that feel that this work would be a valuable contribution to the space. 20 maybe? Okay. Then we're going to take a hum about whether or not this is, if we were to pursue this work, if people feel like this is the right time frame to do this work, given what's going on with Quick and the other work that's in front of the working group. So if you think this would be the right time to initiate that work, you'll hum yes to the first hum. And if you think this is simply not the right time, either because you're opposed to the work or you just think it's not the right time, then you'll hum to the second question. So question one, this is the right time. If you believe that, please hum now. And question two, if you think this is not the right time to do this work, please hum now. All right, it's a tough room for me to really hear, but I heard maybe twice as much hum on the first one as the second. Is that kind of what we heard through the room?
We seem to have verification from DKG, yes.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll take that input and figure out where to go from here.
Great. Thank you.
We've got 15 minutes left, so we're going to get to a little bit of our as time allows.
So, variance up next, I think. Variance, yeah. Okay, can you just... Yeah. Hello again. I'm going to talk briefly about variants, a relatively new draft that I've put up. Go ahead and press space. Thank you. So yeah, in HTTP, we have this notion of secondary cache keys, where the primary use case is, we want to be able to cache something that we've used proactive content negotiation, where you use, a request header to indicate the client's preferences, and the server selects a response based upon that request header. So content codings, content languages, content formats. Also, we have a new working group draft. Well, not new now anymore. It's been around for a while, but new to implementations. Planes to do this on, we're calling client hints, which is really just a collection of new content negotiation axes for things like the device pixel ratio or the window width that the browser currently has.
Mark, I'm sorry. You may need to come back and fix your split screen display.
What's wrong with it?
Oh, okay. I can't advance it.
Oh, press.
Now I did. My apologies. There you go.
Okay. And sometimes, we abuse this into negotiating for things like user agents and cookies and stuff like that too. Next slide. So the currently specified way to do this is the vary header in RFC 7234. And it is very coarse-grained. It can only consider an entire request header as a string, effectively, as that secondary cache key. You can do some canonicalization, but that isn't really well defined, and so we have drift implementation there. Correct implementation, where you actually correctly apply it, is quite expensive because it requires you to kind of touch a lot of different things in your cache or keep a lot of things in memory. And a lot of implementations, as a result, take shortcuts in implementing this. So interop isn't great, and the functionality, because it's so coarse-grained, is quite limited. We hope we can do better. Next slide. We've had a working group draft for a while that Roy and I put together called Key. And this is basically you specify in a response header a recipe for how to figure out the secondary cache key that's appropriate for any given request. And so you say, okay, this key incorporates the user agent, and there's a substring in it. And if the substring includes MSIE, then you go into one bucket. And then you also can have a substring for mobile, and that goes into a different bucket, and then incorporate cookies. And there's kind of a way you combine these things into a logical key for that particular request. And so that's much finer grained. You can target different parts of the header for your secondary cache key. It's also deterministic. You have an algorithm you go through, and that's how you identify the secondary cache key. And hopefully that means that the implementations will be much more aligned. But we've had it out there for a while. It's sat there. We've been asking for implementation feedback for quite some time. And the general feeling that I get is that it's got a couple of really significant downsides. One is that it puts a lot of complexity on the authoring side, on the person generating that header to get that recipe exactly right. And if they don't get it exactly right, bad things may happen. And also, there are a lot of trade-offs. We're creating a little miniature language here for describing the secondary cache key. And there are a lot of trade-offs that you need to make it in the creation of that language to make sure it's compact and relatively flexible. And we're not still certain that we've made the right trade-offs. We're just not there. And so thinking about it and talking to some folks, next slide, we have a new proposal, which is actually informed when I recently joined a lovely new employer. They have been doing this kind of in their own internal systems, where you specify a list of all the possible variants in one axis that are available on the origin server. So you just list them out, and then the intermediary can apply an algorithm to figure out which the appropriate one to use is for a given request. And so what variants does is just generalize that, and it says, variants on the accept encoding plane here, for example, there's gzipped and Brotli available. And on the accept language plane, there's English and French available. And so what happens is that you specify an algorithm for each of these content negotiation axes of how do I select, given a set of these, how do I select the appropriate one given the client's preferences? So the client's expressing their preference in a request header. And then you identify on the response which ones of those were actually used in the variant key. And between those two bits of information, now the intermediary has the ability to select any, the appropriate response for any given request. And that works really well for axes of negotiation where things are known well. For example, language or format or content coding, because all those express the capabilities and the preferences of the client in the request headers, which is kind of what content negotiation is all about. It's not as suitable for request headers with opaque semantics, which was one of the primary usage scenarios for key. People wanted to negotiate on things like cookies. And so one way to view variant is it's a supplement to key, where it's not trying to target cookies and it's not trying to target user agent. It's going for well understood axes of content negotiation. I myself wonder if maybe once we do this, it might be good enough to get rid of key altogether. And it could be possible to maybe retrofit this onto cookies, but I don't want to explore that quite yet. And the other plus is it's simple and intuitive to author. It's much easier than key. I don't know if there's a next slide. Nope. Okay. So that's about it. Like I said, my current employer does have a form of deployment experience with this, and it works really well. This is a much bigger generalization of that. No, I don't have IPR to declare on that, and I've checked into that. You can also view it as something that is very similar to transparent content negotiation. Not TCN. TCN, where you list all the different variants available. The difference here is this is a much simpler, more straightforward HTTP-specific way to do it. And so I'm asking for feedback. I don't know if I'm asking for adoption yet, but I've talked to a lot of folks about it so far, and people seem to be cautiously optimistic.
Martin.
So Martin Thompson, you don't require a fully populated matrix. You just establish the matrix with the response and say which bucket it falls into, and that allows the cache to identify the fact that a particular request falls outside of that bucket.
Exactly, that's exactly right. The first version of variants actually conflated that, so that it conflated the key selection with existing response headers, and for that reason that you put out that there might be a partial matrix, that seemed to be a bad idea. So that's why we have a separate variant key header.
Yeah, this is fine. Yep.
Yeah, and I think the next step for this is to be able to allow variant key to identify multiple possible values you can be used, so that you can fill in that matrix if you want with other responses. Yeah.
Brian Call. I'm interested in this. I'm definitely interested in actually implementing it. This solves a problem that we have, is knowing what kind of content encoding the origins have.
Thanks.
Hi, John. This is not something I understand, but if a server sends back this stuff, will it then say there are no more axes of variation? So that, for instance, if it sends back variants, it will say that I will not create variants based on user agent.
So there are a couple of answers to that. When the cache evaluates a request, it uses ideally the most recent variants header for that resource that it has received. And of course, if it doesn't have anything cached, it'll have to go back to the origin. You still send the vari header with this, because you still have to interoperate with caches that don't understand variants. And it might be that you list more things in the vari header than you do in variants. If you're varying on cookie and variants chooses not to address cookies, then you need to be able to fall back to the vari behavior for cookies, but only for cookies.
Thank you.
And that's a little tricky, but I think we can do that.
I'll take off my chair hat and express some skepticism about that. But I would like to say that this has come up. This is actually solves a sweet spot that has come up with H2 push and push cache interactions. This is, I think, exactly the kinds of things that get pushed that may not be able to be used because of often like image negotiation and formats and that kind of thing is clearly becoming a problem. Anyone else?
Yeah, if anybody's interested in doing some experimentation or experimental implementation, I'd love to chat. I don't think I'm asking for adoption yet, but I think the discussion that would be nice to have is, if we adopt this, do we replace key with it or not? Because I'm still not detecting. All the interest that I detect in key is this is an important space to be working in, but not this particular solution. So I think this might be a better solution.
Yeah, I would want to pursue that line of discussion because key has just been parked with no activity for a while. And
Exactly.
so if we wanted to adopt this, I would do this sort of as a wholesale replacement. I don't much care whether this becomes, n+1 of key or, we swap the documents. But,
Whatever, yeah.
Logically speaking.
And we can always resurrect key down the road if we suddenly decide we need it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we've got 5 minutes left. Thank you, Mark. Siobhan, do you want to try and say a little bit about 451 in the 4.5 minutes that's available? All right.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shivan, and I've been working with the HRPC research group on things related to HTTP status code 451 for the past a few months. And the purpose of this talk is to put forth what we have and get comments and feedback on what would be the right way to move forward. Next slide, please. Next slide, there's no time for outlines. So the purpose of HTTP 451 is to make censorship more transparent. Next slide, please. And it should include an explanation in the response body. So the work we did to see what these status codes look like in the wild, we didn't really see any of these explanations ever. And it should also include a header field that has the blocked by information. This was a source of confusion in most of the instances we saw, because some people interpreted this to mean the organization that's blocking, as in who's actually implementing the block. So an ISP, for example, and others took this to mean the organization that mandated the block. And maybe this is because of the example, which was kind of confusing in the RFC 7725. Next slide, please. So at IETF 99 Hackathon, we wrote some plugins, client-side plugins that would report instances of 451 and report those back to a backend collector. And we also wrote some drafts. Next slide, please. And so one of them was the implementation report draft, where we examined current usage patterns. And we also made some recommendations, which were captured in another draft. Next slide. So the recommendations that we're making are having a blocking authority link header similar to blocked by, so we can make clear the distinction between these two things, and also because we feel it's important information. And we also having a provisional header for the geographical scope of the block, so that because blocks were often that we saw were often scoped to countries, so this would be extremely useful information. So what the form that this would take, we're still talking about that, but I guess what we're thinking right now is having alpha 2 country codes. So a couple of things that we had that not in the slide are there was an errata that was published by Stefan related to the example given in RFC 7725, and we also have we wrote a draft for human rights considerations guidelines on RFC 7725. That's also, I think, relevant. So next slide. So I guess the main question we're asking is, what is the right way to move forward on this? And should we be looking at an RFC 7725-BIS, which combines the human rights protocol considerations plus the new protocol elements? And and as I mentioned, we're also looking for more definition of the geographical scope of block. That's it, pretty much.
Okay. Thanks. Lovely.
So, Martin Thompson, my question was, if you're talking about restricting the geographical area to a country code, that sort of implies that you're narrowing the set of options for blocking authorities to the same extent. Is there any sense in having both fields if you have the blocking authority? So say I identify a particular government that is the government of a particular country. Is there any sense in also identifying the country at that point?
So for one, we would not make that mandatory. You would not have to include the country code. So it could be like if it's wider than the country, then it could just be that. But yeah, that's good. That's a good point.
So my point being, if you're going to keep both of the fields, I think you might want to have a little more detail in the geographical area. Of course, as soon as you get into that, then we get into a huge mess. And we've got some experience with doing geolocation stuff in this organization, and it's unpleasant, to say the least, coming up with a format that will actually describe where something is. Link relations is probably the best path forward for that. Provide a pointer to a document that describes where it is, and then that may solve the problem. The extent of the block, yes, or the geographical region in which the block is supposed to be applied.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, it's something to think about.
Right. We're at time, so I'm going to cut the line, and if we can make this really brief, please.
Sandra Brayman, Texas A&M University. 3 points. One is that by using the word censorship, it's a very broad meaning. It could be fraud. It could be any number of things that we would not typically treat as censorship, but are legitimate reasons for shutting something down. Second, geography is interesting, but if you're talking about the law, you're talking about legal jurisdiction. Geography and legal jurisdiction are two separate questions. It's worth including them both because, of course, many countries try to exercise jurisdiction extraterritorially and do so successfully. And of course, there's a long history of that complexity in the internet. The second thing about jurisdiction is it allows you to go below the national level. It could be state law, it could be municipal ordinance, and so forth. And the third thing is that you've got should for the reason, but just as technical people legitimately criticize those in the legal world for trying to assert something about technical design that has nothing to do with how it works, so in the technical world, if you want to engage with the law, you want to think about how the law works. Anytime something is shut down for legal reasons, the justification must be given. And so I would change the should to must there.
All right. Thank you. Lovely. Okay. We'll chat with you a bit more, perhaps. And Adrian had a presentation about payments, which unfortunately we don't have time to get to. What I might ask is that if he and Patrick and I and Alexi and maybe Wendy can meet right afterwards to have a quick chat, we might be able to give you the feedback you want. So that's it for today. We'll see everyone on Friday, hopefully. Thank you. Adrian said he can't make it on Fridays. If you can, I think 3 minutes. It is freaking yeah. That was pretty good. I was surprised we actually fit almost everything in.
Yeah. That last one was a little rushed.
Yeah.